Part 6. The pack marked looked like a dollar sign laid on its side. There were 4 stars, 2 on top and 2 on the bottom. Werewolves heal fast, so normal tattooing didn't work. There was a special process that forced the mark to stay. Marcus watched and Track smiled. "You'll get yours tonight." "I'm looking forward to it," he smiled. Jackson clicked the pen closed and tossed it on the blanket, but stayed where he was. I leaned back against his chest and used his legs for armrests. A few more wolves ran over and threw their blankets down with us, then plopped on them. "You going to run with us, Reina?" the blonde one asked. "Of course," I smiled, and wiggled one of my running shoes. He grabbed it and laughed. "Still think you're the fastest?" I grinned. "Always am." A few more wolves showed up with coolers, and they tore into them. The 4 other wolves usually hung with Phil. I tilted my head and glanced over, seeing our clique Alpha and Teresa sitting alone on their blanket. I frowned and then flinched when she glared at me. Marcus took a sandwich from Rock and then looked at me. I shrugged. "My food's in my pack," I stated, and he just nodded and took a bite. I turned as Missy giggled and smiled to see Miles leaning into her ear. She grinned at me, and I winked and gave her a thumbs up. I was really happy for them. The guys inhaled the food, talking and ribbing each other about it at the same time. A few minutes later, Phil walked over. "Anyone for a race?" he grinned, slapping his hands together. I jumped to my feet, and Phil pretended to frown. "I don't know, Reina. You're not so good for our egos when it comes to foot races." I grinned and turned, seeing everyone except Missy and Miles standing. "Go show 'em what a girl can do, Reina," Missy smiled, giving a nod of support. There were about 15 of us lined up on a large dirt track. The guys ribbed me, but I knew they were just trying to throw me off. There were very few of them that could actually beat me on foot. Phil walked over to one side, looking over at us. "Okay, you know the rules." "Yeah, there are no rules," a voice called from the line, and the rest of us laughed. Track stepped up next to me, and I wrinkled my nose at him. Then I turned to see Marcus on my other side. "She's only been beat twice," Track grinned, leaning down and looking at Marcus. "Well, I hope she still speaks to me when I make that 3, he laughed. "Ready?" Phil shouted, and the line went silent. "Go!" There was a blur of motion as we all took off. I saw guys reach out and grab each other. Others threw out elbows, and some rolled to the side in a cloud of wrestling dust. I kept my eyes on the target, though, a long chalk line that was 500 feet away from the starting point. I breezed past most of them, grinning at the back of the one person ahead of me. I let a bit more speed out, and they faded behind me. I heard cat calls and cheers from behind me, but I didn't turn. That was always a big mistake. Then I saw something out of the corner of my eye and did steal a look. It was Marcus. His face was tight and his eyes were forward, but I caught a sparkle in them. I leaned forward and pushed harder. We finished with a tie, and I huffed as the others ran up and slapped Marcus on the back and arms. I stood watching, my arms crossed over my chest. Track laughed. "Come on, Ray. We're just happy to have someone that can actually beat you." "He didn't beat me," I pointed out, and Track shrugged. "Well, tie you, even." Marcus turned and smiled at me. "Still friends?" I laughed. "I'm not that shallow. And Track's right. It's nice to finally have some real competition." That started another round of teasing, and I finally laughed and started to walk down towards the lake. The sounds drifted a bit, and I stopped and looked over at the water. There was splashing and laughing to one side, and I saw a group out in the darker water. A sound behind me made me turn, just in time to see Track running at me. I sidestepped, and he pulled up fast to keep from falling into the cold water. I laughed, but he turned and lowered himself, lunging. He got his arms around my knees and threw me over his back. I yelped and slapped his back. "Trent Bandel, don't you dare!" I gasped, still laughing. Jackson and Rock showed up. Jackson was daring him to do it, and Rock decided to play my champion and told him what he would do to him if he did throw me in. I reached down and grabbed handfuls of Track's waistband, holding on as tightly as I could as he spun me around and taunted Rock. I saw something flip out of his pocket, and I recognized it as my cell phone, just as I was twirled around too fast for my liking. "Put me down!" I demanded, still holding onto his pants. "Put her down, Track," Rock growled, though there was no real threat in his voice, and his eyes sparkled with excitement. We had grown up together, and although they might play fight harder than enemies, they were pack brothers. Then I heard a crunch and saw my phone under Jackson's shoe. Oh, my dad is gonna be ticked, I thought. I was whirled around again as Track crouched, holding on to me as if I were a pillow instead of a 5'8" female. He squared off with Rock, and I propped myself up on my elbows, looking around to try to figure a way out of this. Jackson grinned at me, and I stuck my tongue out at him. Then I saw Marcus. His eyes were smiling, but he was watching closely. I shrugged, resting a chin on one hand. "This is why I don't come here much," I stated loudly, and Track huffed. Marcus laughed, and then Track stood up. "Put me down," I stated, trying to sound threatening. "I mean it. Put me down." I slammed a fist into his back, and he grunted, but didn't let go. It seems Jackson decided it was more fun to be on Rock's team and try to save me, so he and Rock crouched and stalked slowly around Track, as if he held the prize. Basically, that is what the game was now. See who could get Reina from Track. I sighed and then tightened my stomach muscles and threw myself up and backwards. Track wasn't expecting that, and I landed hard on my feet, now crouched as well and facing him. "Ooh, now the prey wants to play," he chuckled in a low, taunting voice. I shook my head, stood, and he lunged, but I was faster and twisted out of the way. Unfortunately, Jackson took the opportunity to switch sides yet again. He ran at me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and threw us both into the lake. I screamed as I went, and then landed with a splash, and the water consumed me. I came up flinging water and whipped my ponytail over my head. "I'm gonna kill you," I grunted, but it was through a hard smile. Like I said, I was used to this. Jackson winked at me. "Well, that's not really fair since you're already dead." Suddenly, Track flew through the air, hit Jackson in the chest, and they both went down. The lake sloshed, and their voices were muffled as they fought in the waist-deep water. I shook my head, but stood and watched them, laughing. "Reina went down," Rock yelled across the way in response to someone else's comment. There was laughter farther off, and Rock sloshed into the lake, smiling at me. I went to say something, and then cried out as I was pulled under. I pushed my assailant off of me and kicked. Vampire strength or not, it just loses something when you're trying to do it underwater. Track's face emerged, and he smiled, inches from my own. "You just had to come in and play too, didn't you?" I teased, and he nodded, moving closer to me, with only his head above the water. I laughed and scooted backwards, so I was basically sitting with my hands keeping me off the actual lake bottom. He was on his stomach, with his body out behind him like an alligator. He stopped when he was nose to nose with me, and I blinked so I wouldn't go cross-eyed. He moved back just until we could look at each other, the water still dripping off our faces. Suddenly, I didn't hear the laughter or splashing around me. All I saw were his eyes. The light from the fire danced and reflected in his golden eyes, making them almost glow. The smile slipped away from his face, and then he was gone. Rock surfaced in his place and smiled as he pushed Track under him. I blinked hard, shoving the loose hair out of my face. Rock smiled, lunged forward, and kissed me quickly on the lips. "Told you I would say—" Then he yelped as he was thrown up in the air several feet, with Track emerging like a giant monster in a B-rated movie. I laughed and shook my head, then started to trudge my way through the water and up onto the bank as they battled it out behind me. Marcus stood with a large towel open, and I smiled and stepped into it. He wrapped it around my shoulders and even pulled my hair out of the back for me. "Thanks," I smiled. "They're a bunch of little boys filled with too much musk," I chuckled. We walked back to the blanket, and Missy giggled. "I see they got you." I nodded. "Yeah, let's just hope I can dry off before I have to go home," I stated, feeling the lake water slosh out of my shoes. I winced at the feeling, but grinned. Finally, Rock, Track, and Jackson came clumping up to us. They were a bit out of breath and coated in sand and dirt from shoving each other on the way back. "No wonder you're all still single," I teased. Track looked up at me with a smile that always made me leery. He dropped to all fours and slowly crawled towards me. I raised my eyebrows and turned to find my escape route. He lunged and I rolled out of the way, then jumped to my feet. He was on his just as fast, and I threw the towel at him and took off at a hard run. Track grabbed the towel, shook it, and calmly laid it out on the blanket. "Aren't you going after her?" Rock asked, watching me disappear around the side of the lake. "Course I am," Track chuckled. "Just like giving her a head start. Makes tracking just a little more challenging." Rock chuckled, and Jackson huffed. "Bet I can find her before you do." Track laughed. "You are so on." Marcus stood. "Mind if I get in on that bet?" The three guys nodded, grinning. "What are the stakes?" Jackson asked. "The winner gets to take Reina on a date," Rock replied. Track shoved him hard and he fell on the ground. "You can't make her a bet when she isn't here to okay it." Jackson nodded. "Okay, how about the winner gets to take Reina to the celebration tomorrow night?" Track stood and threw his hands up. "She can't go tomorrow. She has some stupid vampire thing to do." Marcus grinned. "Are your bets always like this?" Rock shook his head. "No, only when she's here." He blinked calmly, as if that wasn't an odd thing to say. Marcus shrugged. "Then how about the winner gets to take her home tonight? Alone?" Track's brows rose. "Drive her car?" Marcus nodded and Jackson smiled. "Oh yeah, I'm in." Track frowned. "She doesn't let anyone drive that car," he stated, suddenly a bit worried about what my reaction might be. "Fair enough. The winner can ride back with her and run home after." Track shrugged. "Fine with me. Go!" he shouted and turned, bolting the way I had gone. Rock threw his head back and howled. The air suddenly filled with a dozen replies as they all set off after me. In the end, it was Track that found me, not only because he was one of the best trackers in the pack, but because I had circled back around and heard the bet, and there was no way I was having any of the others take me home. We were all sitting back on the blankets laughing and talking when Mike ran up. Track turned as his younger brother held out the phone. Track grabbed a towel, brushed the dirt off his hands, and took it. "Hello?" His smile slipped a little and he looked at me. "Oh yeah, she's fine, Mr. Beldrin. We're just down at the lake having a bonfire." He listened and moved his other hand to his back pocket. "I have it right. Well, we kinda ended up in the lake," he stated, as he patted his wet pocket only to find it empty. I bit my lower lip and pointed over to the spot where we had wrestled. Rock jumped up and went over, lifting the mangled piece of blue and black plastic. Trax sighed. No, we have the phone. It's just a little broken, he finally stated, giving me an apologetic shrug. He gave a few more short replies into the phone, then the smile now gone from his face. No, I understand, he sighed. I am fine, Dad, I chuckled, leaning over Track's lap. I just need a new phone. I smiled and Track winked at me, then pushed me so hard I landed on my backside. Right. No, I completely understand, he stated, and I rolled my eyes, leaning back against Rock's bent legs. Track's jaw twitched, and I tilted my head. He only did that when he was really ticked. Finally, he hung up and sighed. When the phone hit the ground, it somehow hit the speed dial. Our eyes widened, and we all looked at the battered thing in Rock's hand. It called Jonathan's phone, he nearly hissed. I frowned and then moaned. Oh, he must have heard us wrestling. Track nodded, drew a deep breath, and then shrugged. He heard you screaming and a bunch of male voices. Then he chuckled, and Rock laughed hard. He and Allison were at the mall, so he called your dad. Who knew better and called your house, I added, smiling now too. Well, first he tried your phone, but yeah, he talked to my dad, and then my dad sent Mike here with his cell. I shrugged. My dad knew better than to worry. Track looked at me. Yeah, he knows you're probably safer here than at the manor. He would never admit to that, I laughed. Jackson nodded. Plus, we are a lot more fun. I had to agree there. Mike knelt down and smiled at me. You're a hot commodity, Reina. Track grabbed his younger brother, rolled him into a headlock, and ran his knuckles over his head. I turned to Marcus. Sorry for the downer. That was a bit embarrassing. Not at all, he smiled. He just wanted to make sure you're okay. What father would do any less? I shrugged and stood, walking over towards the fire. I didn't need the heat for my body, but I wanted to start drying my clothes off. You could always take them off and hang them up to dry, came Jackson's voice. I laughed but didn't turn. Then I heard a thud and Jackson yelping. I grinned, still looking at the fire. I watched the flames lick across the large pieces of wood and felt almost entranced by the dance. I tilted my head and was lost in it when I felt a breath against my neck. I turned, ready to make a smart comment, then stopped when I saw Marcus standing there. He stepped up next to me and nodded, mesmerizing. I stated, a little dopey from having watched it so intensely. Finally, I looked over at him. So, you're going to be living here? I'm actually staying with Track and his family. Ah, I nodded again. They're great. Yes, they are, he smiled. Later, while everyone ate again, Track scooped up my pack and tossed it over his shoulder. We'll be right back, he stated, pulling me to my feet. The others nodded, knowing that I felt weird eating in front of them. No matter how much they said, I just looked like a kid drinking out of a juice box. They could smell the liquid, and getting a wolf near the scent of blood, well, it made strange things happen. We walked towards the edge of the woods, and I shook my head. I don't have to do this now. I'm not taking any chances. Your phone got broken, and you're completely soaked. I don't want to give your dad any reason not to let you come back. He stopped just inside the tree line and pulled my leather backpack off, unzipping it. I sighed and waited while he checked the readout, and then I took the thermos and drank it down. I felt it rush through me, filling me with a very hot sensation, and then it settled. Nothing more theatrical than that, unless I waited too long. Then the effects were a bit different. I handed it back to him. Happy now, Daddy Junior?" He grinned. "Huh, did you just call me Daddy?" I rolled my eyes and he smiled. "I think I like that. Do it again." I shoved him and he caught himself, reaching out and pulling me to him. I gasped and stiffened. He smiled at me, his eyes looking at me in a way I hadn't remembered. I felt an odd sensation and then he winked. "See? I could have you any time I wanted." "You are such an ass," I snapped, grabbed my pack from his hands and stormed off. He called after me, but I didn't slow. I was ticked and very confused, and I didn't like either of those feelings. So I walked over and plopped down next to Marcus. Since he was the only one there, I was sure Track wouldn't just shove out of the way to sit next to me. I spent the next hour trying to ignore him. He gave up trying to flat out bug me, and finally went for the indifferent approach. Little did he know, I was much better at this than he was. Suddenly the air was filled with the sounds of a dozen drums. We all turned, smiling as the drummers walked into the area. They carried large skin drums on straps around their waists or over their shoulders. I loved the sound of the drums, and I sat up excitedly to watch. The drummers were different ages and sizes, but all men. They danced a bit as they paraded through our campfires, beating out their sounds with hands or small mallets. Ceremonial chains of leaves hung around their ankles and wrists, and they wore plaster wolf masks, painted in different colors, pulled up and sitting back on their heads. Their waist wraps were also made from tanned hides, and they had designed and burned and stitched designs into them. I turned and looked at Marcus. He smiled, and I reached out and took his hand. This part of the night always got to me. Since I wasn't speaking to Track, I needed to be close to a pack member. Jackson slid in behind me, and I leaned back against him, still holding Marcus's hand. Then the dancers ran out, and the two groups reenacted stories that had been told for many generations. I lowered my eyes when the one about the wolf and the vampire falling in love started. It was actually a beautiful story. The dancers moved swiftly with grace as well as strength. The story ended sadly, but with a feeling of love so deep that you still envied them. Track finally snuggled up next to me, and I laid my head on his shoulder. He was forgiven. He always was. Sally and the boys showed up later with a roller cooler. Everyone thanked her and dove in. I chuckled and moved out of the way as they fought over the food inside. The drummers were sitting around now, banging out wonderful sounds. The dancers were pulling others out into the dirt area around the fires, and everyone was having a great time. Mike grabbed his food and then came and sat between my legs, leaning back against me as he ate and watched. Track moved in behind me, and Aaron shoved his brother a little and laid down with his head on my thigh. When the food was gone, which didn't take long, we all sat and talked. Aaron decided to tell Marcus about the time I got stuck up in a tree. "She was so high," he declared. "Then she couldn't figure out how to get down." I moaned and looked at the blanket, suddenly noticing how much sand we were sitting in. She was trying to show off her tree climbing skills, Track threw in, and Marcus laughed. "She's actually really good at it," Mike shot out in my defense. Rock nodded. "Well, she was, until we got older. Now I think Jackson is the better climber." I had to shrug. He was right. Jackson had to be part monkey the way he could climb. That started everyone telling Marcus stories of me getting myself into some sort of situation. "Can't we please change the subject?" I finally laughed. Just then there was a howl that filled the air, and everything went quiet. This was a different howl. Someone was on packed territory. Another howl followed. They didn't appear dangerous, but all around the campfires the wolves stood, facing the way the warning had come. We stood as well, and a few others ran off into the trees to change. Track took my hand and looked at his mother and brothers. "We need to get you home," he stated, his face tight. Sally nodded. "There doesn't seem to be a real threat, but yes, we should get the boys back." Marcus, Rock, Jackson, and Track formed a barrier around us as we left all of our things on the blankets and made our way back. Another few howls, and it appeared that the intruders had been spotted and were not wolves. The vocal communication continued as we hurried back to the Bandel house. As we near it, more howls rang out. Track turned and looked at me. "Vampires," he stated. I frowned. "What?" He nodded. He was much better at interpreting the howls than I was. I looked and saw a car heading down the street towards us. Sally took the younger boys and went inside. The others formed a line in front of me. I had to stand on my toes and peek over between their shoulders to see. The car slowed and pulled over to the curb next to us. The passenger window rolled down, and I heard Track curse under his breath. The line broke up, and I got a look at the blonde head that peeked out. "Allison?" I glanced at Track, who was almost baring his teeth. Then the driver's door opened, and I moaned as Jonathan stepped out. Track turned to the others. "I got this one," he stated, and headed towards the car. I jogged over, and Allison smiled, waving out the window. "Jonathan, there she is." I looked at her as if she had gone mad, and then stepped off the curb and walked up next to Track. Jonathan smiled at me and then looked me over. I glanced down at myself and grunted. I was dry, but my pants were torn in a few places, either from the run in the forest or the wrestling matches. I was covered in sand and dirt, and my shoes, well, you couldn't tell what color they used to be. I didn't dare imagine what my hair looked like, although I had lost the ponytail earlier in the night. Allison opened her door, and Rock was instantly in front of her. She smiled up at him. "Hi, I'm Reina's friend." She and Track invited me to come tonight, but I had to help Jonathan shop first. "That's Jonathan," she spit out quickly. Rock, Jackson, and Marcus turned and looked at Track. Allison smiled at him, and his upper lip twitched. Jonathan closed his door and smiled. Allison was a bit upset about having to miss this, so I told her we could stop by on the way back to the manor. He looked at me instead of the others, and I wanted to shrink away and hide. Not only were they on packed territory without escorts, but they were declaring that Track and I invited them, or at least Allison. Track looked at the guys and made a few motions that made them all relax. Allison smiled at Rock. "Wow, you are big," she grinned. That was all it took. Musk-filled Rock, who was actually nicknamed that because of his size, flashed his smile. "And you're pretty cute for a vampire." I rolled my eyes and turned back to Jonathan. "You should have called," I whispered, frowning. "It's considered a threat to come on pack land without an escort." He held up his fancy phone. "Well, actually, I did try to call. Several times," he stated, shooting Track a quick look. Then the vampire walked past him and up to me. "It seems you've been enjoying yourself," he smiled. Dang, there went my knees again. How did guys do that? I could only nod as he reached out and brushed a bit of sand off the side of my face. "I'm glad you had such a good time. You deserved it." I blinked hard, trying to sort out his words when Track stepped up. "It's not midnight yet." "Not for another 20 minutes, Jonathan stated in an even tone as he looked down at his watch. I leaned over to check it and moaned. Then I looked up at Track. He sighed. "Fine, I'll go get the car and take you home." "I'd be happy to take her home," Jonathan stated. "Allison can take my car, and I said I will take her home, he stated, and stormed off towards his house. Rock smiled at Allison and stepped up. Maybe Reina can bring you back again sometime. Allison looked ready to explode, and her head bobbed up and down. Rock walked over to me and gave me a big hug. Don't stay gone so long next time, babe, he stated, then looked at Jonathan as he kissed me on the cheek and turned. Jackson made a few flirting comments to Allison as well, then hugged me. He also flashed Jonathan a hard stare before he left. Dang that Musk. You think human testosterone was bad? Ha! It had nothing on this. And that's where I'm going to stop this one.